4 astronauts just came home from the moon. And the most important thing about that mission is something NASA is not putting in the press release. 10 days. 252,000 miles. One heat shield that everyone already knew was broken. And 6 minutes where 4 human beings fell through fire at 25,000 miles per hour with nobody able to hear them, help them, or even know if they were alive. This is the full story of Artemis II, not the version with the standing ovation. The version with the numbers underneath it that will keep aerospace engineers awake for years. Stay with me because there is something in this mission that nobody is talking about. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why this moment in history is both more extraordinary and more terrifying than anything you saw in the news. Reed Wiseman is a Navy test pilot. He has a daughter named Katie and a daughter named Ellie. Before he boarded that rocket, he posted a photo of the 3 of them together and wrote, "I love these 2 ladies, and I am boarding that rocket, a very proud father." 6 years before that photo, his wife Carol was diagnosed with cancer. She told him not to quit, not to move the family. She said, "This is where you work and you love your job, and we should not give that up for this." She died in May of 2020. She was 46 years old. He raised those 2 girls alone, trained for the most dangerous mission in a generation, and then sat inside a capsule with no radio, falling through plasma, knowing that if the engineers were wrong, those daughters would lose their remaining parent too. That is who was inside the spacecraft. That is what was at stake. And that is what nobody mentions when they show you the parachutes opening over the Pacific. Now let me tell you what actually happened. Not just what the cameras showed, what the physics said. On April 1st, 2026, the Space Launch System rocket left Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. It carried 4 people, Reed Wiseman as commander, Victor Glover as pilot, Christina Koch as mission specialist, and Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency. Their capsule was named Integrity. That name was either earned or ironic depending on what happened 9 days later, and they would not know which until they were either alive in the Pacific Ocean or they were not. The rocket worked. The translunar injection burn worked. A 6-minute engine firing pushed them out of Earth orbit and onto a path toward the moon, making them the first humans to leave low Earth orbit since December 1972. 53 years, more than half a century since any human being had gone further than a few hundred miles above the surface we live on. On April 6, they flew around the moon. At their farthest point, they were 252,760 miles from Earth. To understand that number, the Apollo 13 crew had held the distance record since 1970, 53 years. Artemis II broke it by more than 4,000 miles in 10 days. But here is where I need you to pay close attention, because what I'm about to explain is the thing that the celebration was designed to hide, not through deception. Through celebration, and there is a difference. The heat shield on the Orion spacecraft is made of a material called Avcoat. It is an ablative thermal protection system. All that means is it is designed to burn away in a controlled and predictable fashion during re-entry, layer by layer, like a candle melting from the outside in, carrying heat away from the spacecraft as it goes. The crew inside stays alive. Simple in theory. In practice, something went wrong the first time they tested it. In December 2022, NASA launched Artemis I. No astronauts. Just the Orion capsule on a test runabout on a moon and back. The flight looked perfect. The capsule splashed down. Recovery teams fished it out of the water, and then they flicked it over and looked at the bottom. The heat shield had not ablated evenly. Pieces of the outer char layer had cracked apart and blown off in chunks. Not small chips. Fragments large enough that NASA's own Office of Inspector General described them as creating a trail of debris behind the spacecraft during re-entry. Engineers found damage in over 100 locations across the shield's surface. Now here is the critical detail that I need you to understand before we go any further. The Artemis II heat shield was already built and bolted onto the spacecraft before engineers had even finished analyzing what had gone wrong with Artemis I. By the time they figured out the root cause, replacing the Artemis II shield would have meant years of additional delay to a program already behind schedule by half a decade. So NASA made a decision: fly it anyway. The logic was this: the damage on Artemis I was caused specifically by the skip re-entry trajectory, a technique where the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, bounces back up briefly, then plunges down again for final descent. During that bounce, the outer char layer cooled and sealed, while the inner layers stayed scorching hot, trapping gas with nowhere to go. Pressure built. Cracks formed. Chunks blew off. The fix was not to replace the shield. The fix was to change how they flew through the atmosphere. Instead of skipping, Artemis II would take a steeper, more direct path. Come in fast, come in hot, keep the heating rate high and continuous so the outer char layer never gets a chance to cool down and seal itself shut. Keep it permeable. Let the gas vent. Problem solved. Read that again slowly. NASA's solution to a heat shield that cracked under heat was to expose it to more heat. Not less. More. Now. A former astronaut named Charles Camerda publicly disagreed with this decision. Camerda was a heat shield expert. He'd been part of the first shuttle crew to fly after the Columbia disaster. He knew what he was talking about. He estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 20. NASA's own safety threshold for crew loss during re-entry is supposed to be roughly 1 in 500. He compared the analytical approach NASA used to evaluate the shield to the same institutional failures that led to Challenger and Columbia. He said the agency had not fully modeled how cracks could propagate under the modified trajectory, and that the decision to fly was driven by schedule pressure rather than engineering certainty. And I want to be honest with you here, because honesty is what this deserves. Camerda may have been wrong. An independent review team examined the test data and agreed with NASA's conclusions. Commander Wiseman himself said he had sat in the engineering meetings, walked through the data himself, and was satisfied. He said if we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned, this heat shield will be safe to fly. But notice what that sentence means. It means the shield was not safe on any re-entry path. It was safe on this specific re-entry path. That is a workaround, not a fix, and workaround have a history in the American space program that should make everyone uncomfortable. January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center on a cold Florida morning. Icicles had formed on the launch pad overnight. Engineers at the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters had spent the previous evening on a teleconference arguing against the launch. They had data showing that O-ring seals in the booster joints lost flexibility in cold temperatures. They had charts. They had test results. One senior engineer named Roger Boisjoli would later testify that he had felt physically ill watching the launch because he believed the O-rings would fail. NASA pushed back. The agency was under schedule pressure. There had already been multiple delays. The Teacher in Space program had generated enormous public attention, and every delay was news. The conversation that night involved NASA managers asking the engineering team to prove it was unsafe to fly, rather than requiring NASA to prove it was safe. That inversion of the burden of proof. Prove it is unsafe rather than prove it is safe. That is one of the most important details in the entire Challenger story. 73 seconds after launch, Challenger broke apart. At least some of the crew members were conscious during the fall. Emergency air packs had been activated. They were alive and falling for nearly 3 minutes, and there was nothing anyone could do. 17 years later. February 1, 2003. The Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry over Texas and Louisiana. During launch 16 days earlier, a briefcase-sized piece of foam insulation had separated from the external tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing. Engineers on the ground saw it. They requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. That request was denied by management. An engineering team used a mathematical model to estimate the damage and concluded it was within acceptable limits. But the model had never been validated for the actual size of foam that hit Columbia. The team flagged this. The flag was not acted upon. For 16 days, Columbia orbited Earth with a hole in its wing that nobody on the ground had confirmed or denied. The crew did not know. They conducted experiments. They took photographs. They went about their mission. During re-entry, superheated plasma entered the wing through the damage. The orbiter broke apart over 2 states. All 7 crew members were lost. Here is what connects these 2 disasters to Artemis II. A sociologist named Diane Vaughan spent years researching Challenger and then was called in to analyze Columbia. What she found in both cases was not incompetence. It was not corruption. It was something far more insidious and far harder to stop. She called it the normalization of deviance. The basic idea works like this. An organization designs a system with certain specifications. On the first mission, something deviates from the specification. Not catastrophically, just measurably. The deviation is noted. Engineers discuss it. Management evaluates the risk. The mission succeeded. Nobody died. So the deviation is accepted. It becomes the new baseline. On the next mission, the same deviation occurs, and this time it is expected. It is no longer an anomaly. It is just how the system works. Over time, through repetition and survival, what was originally a warning sign becomes background noise. The O-rings on Challenger had shown erosion on 24 previous flights before the 25th one killed 7 people. The foam on Columbia had shed on 113 missions before the 114th one killed 7 more. The Avcoat heat shield on Artemis II, the heat shield that cracked and spooled in over 100 locations on its only previous flight. The heat shield that was not replaced but was instead worked around with a modified trajectory, has now survived 1 crewed flight. 1. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not telling you Artemis II was going to end in disaster. I am not saying the engineers were wrong. The mission succeeded. The crew is home safe. The trajectory worked. But the pattern, the structural pattern that Vaughan documented, fits. And when that pattern fits, the burden should be on the organization to prove this time is different, not on the rest of us to assume it. Now, let me tell you what those 6 minutes were actually like, because I think you deserve the specifics, not the drama, the physics. At 7:53 in the evening on April 10, 2026, Orion crossed 400,000 feet of altitude. Entry interface. The capsule was traveling at 24,661 miles per hour, roughly 32 times the speed of sound, fast enough to cross the continental United States in approximately 6 minutes. At that speed, the air in front of the capsule cannot get out of the way fast enough. It compresses. It heats. Within seconds, the spacecraft was surrounded by a sheath of ionized plasma, a fireball with exterior temperatures reaching approximately 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to melt titanium, hot enough to melt almost anything human beings know how to make. Inside that fireball, the crew could see orange and pink light streaming past the windows. They could feel the deceleration pressing them into their seats at nearly 4 times their body weight. Breathing becomes deliberate at that level. You have to consciously squeeze air into your lungs against the force trying to flatten your chest. Your vision narrows. Your arms weigh 40 pounds each. And they could not talk to anyone. The plasma surrounding the capsule was electrically charged. Ionized gas is a conductor, and it blocks radio signals completely. For 6 minutes during the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, the crew of Artemis II was completely cut off from mission control. No voice, no telemetry, no data, just 4 people inside a burning capsule trusting that the math was right. At mission control in Houston, flight director Jeff Rattigan and his team sat in silence. Rattigan had described it beforehand with the kind of understatement that people who do this for a living develop. We will just be thinking through things to keep ourselves calm as we wait for reacquisition of signal. Think about what that means. A room full of the most capable aerospace engineers on the planet, people who had spent years training for this exact moment, staring at screens that showed nothing, listening to speakers that played nothing, knowing that 4 of their colleagues were inside a burning capsule with a shield that had failed on its only previous flight, and knowing that the next voice they heard would either confirm that everything worked or that it had not. And there was no third option. 6 minutes. Then a voice crackled through the static. Houston, integrity. We have you loud and clear. Reed Wiseman, calm, steady, as if he had just checked the mail. The shield held. The modified trajectory worked. The continuous heating kept the Avcoat permeable. The gases vented. The char layer eroded the way it was supposed to, slowly and predictably, without cracking, without fracturing, without blowing chunks of itself into the hypersonic slipstream. The bet paid off. At 22,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deployed. At 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes billowed open, each one the size of a football field, hauling the capsule down to 17 miles per hour. At 8:07 in the evening, Orion hit the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego with what NASA called a perfect bullseye splashdown. The entire re-entry from atmosphere to ocean lasted 13 minutes. The blackout was 6 of those. 4 astronauts climbed out of a hatch they had last used 10 days and 700,000 miles earlier. But now I need to tell you about something that almost nobody in mainstream coverage mentioned. Something invisible. Something the crew carried home in their bodies without knowing the full weight of it. During those 10 days beyond Earth's magnetic shield, the crew absorbed radiation. Each of the 4 Artemis II crew members received a preliminary dose of 12 millisieverts. To put that in context, the average person absorbs about 3 millisieverts per year from natural background radiation. A chest CT scan gives you about 7 millisieverts. So in 10 days, the Artemis II crew each absorbed roughly the equivalent of 2 chest CT scans or 4 years of natural background exposure. Now 12 millisieverts is within NASA's career safety limits. The crew is healthy. But here is the part that matters. That 12 millisieverts is approximately 18% higher than NASA's pre-flight models predicted. Not a rounding error, not a calibration issue. 18%, nearly 1/5 higher than every model, every simulation, every calculation that NASA's radiation environment team produced in the years leading up to this mission. On a 10-day mission, 18% is the difference between 12 millisieverts and about 10. That is manageable. But take that same 18% error and apply it to a lunar surface mission. Apply it to the eventual Mars mission if it ever happens, where a crew would spend roughly 900 days in transit and on the surface. On a 900-day Mars mission, an 18% radiation modeling error is not a small difference. It could be the difference between staying within career dose limits and exceeding them. It could be the difference between a crew that comes home healthy and a crew that develops radiation-induced cardiovascular disease in their 40s and 50s. Which brings me to the most important thing I will say in this entire video, and almost nobody is saying it. In 2016, a researcher named Michael Delp at Florida State University published a study that should have been front-page news everywhere. It was simple in design and devastating in its findings. Delp and his colleagues looked at every NASA astronaut who had ever flown in space and divided them into 3 groups. Astronauts who were selected but never flew, astronauts who flew only in low Earth orbit, and the Apollo lunar astronauts. 24 men who, until April of this year, were the only human beings in history to have left Earth's magnetosphere and traveled through deep space. Delp's team tracked mortality data for all 3 groups with particular attention to cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, atherosclerosis. The results were stark. Non-flight astronauts, 9% cardiovascular disease mortality. Low Earth orbit astronauts, 11%. No statistically significant difference between those 2 groups. Flying in space, at least in the protected environment of low Earth orbit, did not meaningfully increase your risk of dying from heart disease. Apollo lunar astronauts, 43% cardiovascular disease mortality, 4 to 5 times higher than either of the other groups. Let me say that number again because it is one of the most important numbers in the history of human spaceflight, and almost nobody knows it. The only human beings who had ever traveled through deep space to the moon and back died of cardiovascular disease at a rate 4 to 5 times higher than astronauts who stayed in low Earth orbit. Same selection criteria, same physical fitness standards, same era of medicine and healthcare. The only variable that differed between the groups was exposure to deep space radiation. Delp's team then ran an animal study, exposed mice to heavy ion radiation that simulates the galactic cosmic rays encountered beyond Earth's magnetosphere. After 6 months, which is roughly equivalent to 20 human years in biological aging terms, the irradiated mice showed significant damage to the vascular endothelium, the thin layer of cells that lines the interior of every blood vessel in the body. Endothelial dysfunction is the first step in a well-documented cascade that leads to atherosclerosis, which is the hardening and narrowing of arteries, which is the primary cause of heart attacks and strokes. The proposed pathway is this. Galactic cosmic radiation passes through a spacecraft and its crew continuously during a deep space mission. It damages the endothelial cells of blood vessels at the molecular level. The damage is subtle enough that it causes no immediate symptoms. The astronaut feels fine. The mission continues. But over decades, the accumulated endothelial damage progresses into full-blown cardiovascular disease at a rate that massively exceeds what you'd expect from age, genetics, or lifestyle alone. Now, I need to be honest with you about the limitations of this study. The Apollo sample size is small. 24 total lunar astronauts. At the time of Delp's study, only 7 of them had died from cardiovascular disease. 7 deaths is not enough to draw sweeping conclusions from, and some researchers have questioned whether the 43% figure is statistically robust. A follow-up study in 2018 found elevated cardiovascular risk in astronauts but less dramatic numbers than DELP reported. The question is genuinely open. It has not been settled, and that is exactly what makes it so concerning. The reason it has not been settled is that the sample size has been too small. Only 24 human beings had ever been beyond Earth's magnetosphere before April of this year. That is not enough people to run the kind of large-scale study that would give you a definitive answer. You would need hundreds, ideally thousands, of deep space travelers to resolve the statistical uncertainty. The Artemis II crew, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen, just became the 25th through 28th human beings to travel beyond Earth's magnetosphere. They absorbed approximately 12 millisieverts over 10 days, 18% more than predicted. Blood samples were taken aboard Orion and will be analyzed for chromosomal damage, DNA breakage, and other biomarkers of radiation injury over the coming months. The long-term cardiovascular effects, if the DELP findings are correct, will not manifest for 20, 30, or 40 years. The Artemis II crew cannot answer that question today. They are healthy. They feel fine. The dosimeters read within limits, but the Apollo data suggests the answer may not arrive for decades. It suggests that the biological cost of deep space radiation operates on a time scale that is fundamentally incompatible with the way we evaluate mission safety. We assess risk before the mission. We celebrate success after the mission. But the damage, if the DELP data is real, does not manifest until long after both the assessment and the celebration are distant memories. Now let me tell you about something that was not in the mission briefings. The things that went wrong during those 10 days that barely made the news. The toilet broke on day 1. NASA's onboard waste management system cost approximately $30 million to develop. It malfunctioned shortly after launch, and the crew had to work with mission control to troubleshoot it. One astronaut took on the informal role of what NASA's own blog described as space plumber. The system was eventually restored, but NASA confirmed after splashdown that it will require a full redesign for future missions. A $30 million system on its first crewed flight failed within hours of launch. Shortly after launch, the crew also experienced a loss of communications with mission control for a period that has not been precisely disclosed. NASA was unable to receive telemetry data from the spacecraft, and the crew's voice transmissions were not getting through. The failure was asymmetric in a way that made it particularly unsettling. The astronauts could hear mission control, but mission control could not hear them. They were listening to instructions from a ground team that had no idea whether those instructions were being received or followed. For a brief window, the most advanced crewed spacecraft ever built was flying toward the moon with a one-way phone line. After splashdown, NASA mission managers confirmed the European service module will require a valve redesign based on in-flight performance data. The details are limited. NASA has not specified which valve or what the anomaly was, or how close it came to affecting the mission. But a redesign is required. That tells you something operated outside expected parameters in a system responsible for keeping the crew alive. And I want to be fair here. Test flights have anomalies. That is the entire point of a test flight. Finding issues on Artemis II is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the test worked. Every Apollo mission had problems. Gemini missions had problems. The shuttle's first flights had problems. The toilet was fixed. The communications were restored. The valve did not cause a mission failure. The crew came home, but when you step back and look at them together, a heat shield that was worked around rather than fixed, a toilet that failed on day 1, a communication system that went asymmetric after launch, software crashes, a valve that needs a redesign, and an 18% radiation overshoot, you have to ask a question that the celebration does not invite you to ask. Is this the failure pattern for 10 days with 4 people on a mission that had a free return trajectory built in, meaning the moon's gravity would swing them back toward Earth automatically even if every engine failed? What is the failure pattern for 30 days? For 90 days? For the 900 days of a round trip to Mars, where there is no free return trajectory, where mission control is up to 24 minutes away by radio, where you cannot splash down in the Pacific if things go wrong because the Pacific is 55 million miles behind you? That question is the gap. The distance between a 10-day test flight with manageable anomalies and a multi-year expedition where every one of those anomalies becomes a potential catastrophe. And now let me tell you about the timeline. Because, while everyone was watching Artemis II fly around the moon, something happened to the mission schedule that deserved far more attention than it received. Artemis III, which had originally been planned as the mission that would return American astronauts to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972, was downgraded. It will no longer attend to landing. Instead, Artemis III, now targeted for mid-2027, will be an orbital test of the commercial landing vehicles in Earth orbit. Not lunar orbit. Earth orbit. No landing, no surface operations. Just a rendezvous and docking test. The actual crewed lunar landing has been pushed to Artemis IV, now targeted for early 2022. If that date holds, and the people whose job it is to evaluate these timelines are expressing serious doubt that it will, Artemis IV will be the first American crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 in December 1972, 56 years between boots on the moon. The reason Artemis III was downgraded comes down to one word: Starship. SpaceX's Starship human landing system is the vehicle NASA is counting on to carry astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface and back up again. By any measure, it is the most ambitious rocket ever designed. Nearly 400 feet tall. Designed to be fully reusable, uses a propulsion system that requires in-orbit refueling, meaning multiple tanker flights launching from Earth, rendezvousing in orbit, transferring cryogenic propellant from one vehicle to another in microgravity, a process that has never been demonstrated at this scale. As of early 2026, Starship HLS had not completed its propellant transfer demonstration. It had not completed its design certification review. NASA officials acknowledged publicly that SpaceX was behind on development. NASA's Independent Safety Oversight Panel published a report expressing what they carefully described as serious doubt about whether the timeline was obtainable. To land the crew on the moon using the Artemis architecture, the following things have to happen in sequence without failure. A Starship HLS vehicle launches into Earth orbit. Between 10 and 16 additional tanker flights launch, rendezvous, and transfer propellant to the HLS vehicle in microgravity. The fully fueled HLS heads for the moon. It enters lunar orbit. It waits for the Orion spacecraft, which has been launched separately. They dock. 2 crew members transfer to the lander. The lander descends to the surface. The crew conduct surface operations. The ascent vehicle launches. It redocks with Orion in lunar orbit. The crew transfers back. Orion heads home through the heat shield that was worked around rather than fixed. Every single one of those steps has to work. The vehicle that is supposed to accomplish most of this has not passed its most basic tests. I said at the beginning of this video that there is something in this mission that nobody is talking about. And I meant it, because the real story of Artemis II is not the distance record. It is not the perfect splashdown. It is not even the heat shield. The real story is what this mission revealed about the gap between our ambitions and our readiness, between the future we announce and the present we have funded, between the press conference and the post-flight inspection report. The heat shield is a gap in engineering. The radiation data is a gap in biology. The normalization of deviance is a gap in institutions, and the Starship delays are a gap in timelines. But underneath all of them is a single unifying gap. The distance between what we say we are ready to do in space and what we are actually capable of doing safely. Now I need to tell you about a moment that happened 4 days before splashdown that I think matters more than any of the technical details. More than the heat shield data, more than the radiation numbers. On April 6th, floating 252,000 miles from Earth, farther than any human had ever traveled, the crew of Artemis II looked through Orion's windows at craters no human eyes had ever seen up close. Jeremy Hansen, voice cracking, told Houston that the crew wanted to name one of them. They named it Carol, a bright spot on the moon. Visible from Earth at certain times of the lunar cycle, the crew wrapped their arms around each other and floated in silence while Mission Control said nothing for 45 seconds. Victor Glover, the mission's pilot and the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit, called a solar eclipse they witnessed from behind the moon one of the greatest gifts of the mission. Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest continuous space flight by a woman, described the far side of the moon as something that defied every simulation they had studied for years. And Jeremy Hansen, who became the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit, used the distance record moment to issue a challenge. He said, "We choose this moment to challenge this generation and the next, to make sure this record is not long-lived." And Reed Wiseman came out of the capsule last, stepped onto the recovery raft, looked up at the sky he had been falling through minutes earlier. His daughters were waiting. There is a small bright crater on the near side of the moon that does not have an official name yet. The crew calls it Carol. If you know where to look, you can see it from your backyard during certain phases of the lunar cycle. A small bright spot on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are only beginning to explore. Challenger's O-rings survived 24 flights before the 25th one killed 7 people. Columbia's foam survived 113 missions before the 114th one killed 7 more. The Apollo astronauts flew to the moon and came home to ticker tape parades, and then spent the next 4 decades slowly developing cardiovascular disease that nobody connected to their missions until a researcher published a paper in 2016 that most people never read. The Artemis II crew is home tonight. They are safe. They broke a record that stood for 53 years. They witnessed a solar eclipse from behind the moon. They named a crater for a woman who died too young and told her husband not to stop doing the thing he loved. They brought back data that will shape the future of human spaceflight for decades to come. And somewhere in a document that very few people will read, the numbers are telling a story the press conference did not. 12 millisieverts, 18% above models, over 100 locations of Charlos on the previous flight, 1 crewed flight of the Avco to workaround, 43% cardiovascular mortality in the only humans who had ever done what this crew just did. The terrifying truth that Artemis II confirmed is not that space is dangerous. Every person who has ever looked up at the night sky knows that. The terrifying truth is that the gap between our ambitions and our readiness is not closing as fast as our timeline suggests. That the biological cost of deep space travel may be accumulating in ways we do not yet fully understand. That the institutional habits that have preceded every catastrophic failure in NASA's history are present in the decisions being made today. And the choice between correction and catastrophe is not a choice that gets made once in a dramatic moment with cameras rolling. It gets made every day. In every meeting, in every risk acceptance determination, in every decision to fly a workaround rather than fix the underlying problem. The stars are not going anywhere. The question is whether we are ready to go to them honestly. And after everything I have just told you, I think you know the honest answer is not yet. Not quite. But here is what I believe, and I mean this genuinely. The fact that we're having this conversation at all, the fact that Wiseman and Glover and Koch and Hansen came home safely, the fact that there is now a crater on the moon named for a woman who told her husband not to quit, means that the people doing this work are not reckless. They are human. They're working inside institutions with real pressures and real constraints and real schedules. And they brought 4 people home from 252,000 miles away on a heat shield that everyone was watching, and a trajectory that nobody had ever flown before with people aboard. That is not nothing. That is extraordinary. The question is not whether we can do this. We just proved we can orbit the moon. The question is whether we can be honest enough about what we do not yet know to do it safely when we go further. What do you think? Do you believe NASA made the right call flying that heat shield? And here is something I am genuinely curious about. If you were one of those engineers in the room when they decided to fly the workaround rather than delay the mission, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of video you want to see more of, the kind that goes past the press conference and into the numbers that actually matter, then you know what to do. And if something in this video surprised you, share it with someone who thinks they already know the Artemis II story, because I promise you, they do not know all of it. Carol is up there right now, small and bright on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are learning. That feels exactly right for where we are.